She collapsed at the Vampire King's feet, begging him to end her suffering, but he froze when he saw the bite mark on her neck. It wasn't from any ordinary vampire. The wound bore the distinctive pattern of his supposedly dead brother, and if Marcus was alive, it meant the peace treaty protecting humans was a lie. Isabella Chen collapsed at the obsidian steps of the Vampire King's throne, her knees striking cold marble, with a sound that echoed through the vaulted chamber like a gunshot. The ancient hall fell silent, except for the rasp of her breathing, each exhale carrying the metallic scent of blood, and something darker, something wrong. King Adrian Blackthorn descended 3 steps before freezing, his silver eyes fixed on the wound marring her pale neck. The bite mark wasn't clean, wasn't surgical, like the feeding marks he'd grown accustomed to seeing in his centuries of rule. This was violent, purposeful, carved with the distinctive triple spiral pattern that made his dead heart clench with recognition. Only one vampire had ever fed that way, marking his victims like a signature in flesh and blood. Marcus. His supposedly dead brother, whose execution he'd overseen 127 years ago, whose ash he'd scattered to the 4 winds with his own hands. Isabella lifted her head, tears streaming down her cheeks as black veins spread like spider webs from the wound, pulsing with each labored heartbeat. Her brown eyes, still human but beginning to flicker with dangerous gold, met his with desperate pleading. "Kill me," she whispered, the words barely audible but carrying the weight of absolute terror. "Please, before I become like him, before I lose myself completely." The transformation was accelerating, too fast for a normal turning, and Adrian recognized the signs of corrupted blood magic, the kind Marcus had always been drawn to despite centuries of warnings about its dangers. The girl's hands shook as she pressed them against the spreading darkness on her throat, and Adrian could smell her fear mixing with the coppery tang of her changing blood. Captain Lucian stepped forward from his position beside the throne, his hand moving instinctively to the silver blade at his hip. "My lord," he said, his voice careful and measured. "If she's been turned by unauthorized feeding, the law requires immediate execution to prevent the spread of corruption." The gathered court murmured agreement, their voices rising like the whisper of autumn leaves. But Adrian raised his hand for silence. His fingers trembled almost imperceptibly, a weakness none of his subjects had ever witnessed in their unshakable king. The recognition of that bite pattern had shattered something inside him, some carefully constructed wall between past and present that he'd spent over a century building. "Tell me everything," Adrian commanded, his voice cutting through the chamber's tension like a blade through silk. Isabella's body convulsed as another wave of transformation pain racked her frame, but she fought to speak through gritted teeth. "3 days ago," she gasped, "I was working late in the museum archives, cataloging some medieval manuscripts that had just arrived from a private collection. The basement storage area was empty, just me and thousands of years of human history sleeping in climate-controlled cases." She paused, her hand moving to touch the wound, then jerking away as if the contact burned. He came out of nowhere, like he'd been waiting. Silver hair, eyes like frozen mercury, and when he smiled I could see fangs that looked older than time itself. The description hit Adrian like a physical blow, confirming his worst fears. Marcus had always been vain about his appearance, maintaining the silver hair he'd possessed when first turned in the 13th century, and his eyes had been the same pale shade as Adrian's own. But where Adrian had learned control over the centuries, Marcus had embraced the monster within, letting it reshape him into something that barely resembled the brother Adrian remembered from their mortal lives. Isabella continued speaking, her voice growing stronger even as her humanity continued to slip away. "He didn't just feed," she said, her eyes beginning to glow with predatory light. "He talked while he drained me, whispered about the old ways, about how vampires used to rule instead of hide. Said the peace treaty was a joke, that his brother had gone soft playing politics with humans who would exterminate us all given the chance." Adrian's mind reeled back 127 years to that terrible night in the Grand Assembly when he'd been forced to execute Marcus in front of both vampire nobility and human dignitaries. The Covenant of Shadows had been newly signed, a delicate treaty that forbade the creation of new vampires without explicit council approval, designed to prevent the kind of unchecked spread that had once threatened to expose their entire species to human discovery. Marcus had violated those laws repeatedly, creating dozens of bound vampires loyal only to him, building what amounted to a private army in direct defiance of everything Adrian was trying to accomplish. The trial had been swift, the evidence overwhelming, and the sentence carried out with an obsidian stake through the heart while witnesses from both species watched in solemn silence. Adrian had watched his brother turn to ash, had personally scattered those remains across running water to ensure no resurrection was possible. Or so he'd believed. But now, staring at Isabella's corrupted bite mark and hearing her description of Marcus's words, he realized his brother had somehow survived, had been hiding and planning for over a century, while Adrian built the careful political balance that kept vampires and humans from mutual annihilation. The peace treaty that protected millions of innocent lives suddenly felt as fragile as spun glass, ready to shatter at the slightest pressure. Isabella's transformation was accelerating beyond anything Adrian had witnessed in his long existence. Normally, the turning took weeks, a gradual process that allowed the new vampire time to adjust to their enhanced senses and growing hunger. But the black corruption spreading from her wound suggested Marcus had learned new techniques during his supposed death, ways to force the change that left his victims bound to his will rather than free to choose their own path. She's not becoming one of us, Adrian realized with growing horror. She's becoming one of his creatures, a puppet dancing to strings only Marcus could see. The girl's breathing became labored as her body fought against the foreign magic reshaping her cells, her humanity warring with the predatory instincts being forcibly awakened. Her fingernails lengthened into claws that scraped against the marble floor, and when she looked up at Adrian again, her eyes had shifted completely to gold, reflecting the torchlight like a cat's in the darkness. But beneath the supernatural glow, he could still see the terrified woman she'd been just moments before, trapped inside a transformation she'd never chosen, and desperately fighting to retain some fragment of herself. Marcus had always been cruel, even in their mortal lives, but this went beyond simple sadism. This was a calculated assault on everything Adrian had built, a message written in corrupted flesh and twisted magic. By turning this innocent woman using forbidden techniques, by marking her with his distinctive feeding pattern, Marcus was declaring war not just on Adrian's authority, but on the very principles that had kept their species from becoming extinct. The peace treaty wasn't just political convenience, it was survival itself. And if Marcus was creating unauthorized vampires in violation of every law that protected both species from mutual destruction, then the careful balance Adrian had spent over a century maintaining was already crumbling. Sarah emerged from the shadows beside the throne, her ancient features grave with understanding. Adrian's former lover and current advisor had been present at Marcus's execution, had helped Adrian scatter the ashes that should have ended his brother's threat forever. The corruption in her bite mark, Sarah said quietly, studying Isabella's writhing form with clinical detachment. It's not natural vampire magic. This is blood sorcery, the kind the old covens used before the Great Purge. If Marcus has learned to bind his victims during the turning process, then every vampire he creates becomes an extension of his will rather than an independent being. The implication struck Adrian like hammer blows. A vampire bound to another's will couldn't refuse orders, couldn't choose their own path, couldn't even truly die without their master's permission. It was the kind of slavery their species had fought wars to eliminate, and if Marcus was building an army of such creatures, then he wasn't just planning to break the peace treaty, he was preparing to reshape vampire society itself according to his twisted vision. Isabella convulsed again, her back arching as the corruption reached her heart, and for a moment Adrian saw not the woman she was, but the weapon she was being forged into. Yet something in her eyes, some spark of defiant humanity that refused to be extinguished, reminded Adrian why the peace treaty mattered in the first place. Isabella Chen had been an innocent working alone in museum archives, dedicating her life to preserving human history and culture. She didn't deserve to become a pawn in a war between brothers, didn't deserve to have her humanity stripped away to serve Marcus's ambitions for revenge. If Adrian was going to stop his brother, if he was going to save the treaty that protected millions of lives, he would need to start by saving the woman trembling at his feet. Against every protocol his court expected, against every law that demanded immediate execution of unauthorized vampires, Adrian Blackthorne made a choice that would reshape the supernatural world. He knelt beside Isabella, ignoring the shocked gasps of his assembled nobles, and placed one pale hand against her fevered cheek. "You will not die today," he told her, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "And you will not become his puppet. I give you sanctuary in this house, protection under my power, and the chance to choose your own path once the corruption is cleansed from your blood." The court erupted in protest, but Adrian's silver eyes blazed with an intensity that silenced every voice, because for the first time in over a century, the Vampire King was no longer just a politician balancing competing interests, but a predator defending his territory from an enemy who had made the mistake of threatening something under his protection. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The obsidian fortress had stood for 8 centuries, its black walls carved with protective wards that pulsed with silver light whenever supernatural threats approached its boundaries. Adrian carried Isabella through corridors lined with ancient tapestries depicting vampire history, past portraits of kings and queens who had ruled before the Great Treaty reshaped their world from one of dominance to one of careful coexistence. The warded chambers where new vampires traditionally learned to control their bloodlust lay deep within the fortress heart, behind doors inscribed with binding spells that could contain even the most violent newly turned. Adrian placed Isabella on the 4-poster bed carved from a single piece of midnight oak, its frame inscribed with calming runes that should have soothed her transformation, agony. But the corruption spreading through her veins seemed to resist every magical remedy his court physicians attempted. Her temperature spiked beyond what any vampire should survive, her pulse racing at rates that should have stopped her heart entirely, and the black veins spreading from Marcus's bite mark pulsed with malevolent energy that made the protective wards flicker and dim whenever she thrashed against the restraints. Sarah materialized from the shadows like smoke given form, her ancient features grave with concern as she studied Isabella's rapidly changing condition. Adrian's former lover had been his advisor for 3 centuries, had stood beside him through the treaty wars and the Great Purge, had helped him build the delicate political balance that kept vampires from extinction while allowing humans to sleep safely in their beds. But even Sarah's vast experience with vampire transformations couldn't explain what was happening to Isabella Chen. "This isn't a normal turning," Sarah murmured, her fingers hovering over the spreading corruption without quite touching the infected flesh. "The magical resonance is all wrong, too fast, too controlled. Most new vampires experience chaotic surges of power and hunger, their bodies adapting gradually to supernatural abilities over weeks or months. But Isabella's transformation was following a precise pattern, as if someone was guiding the process remotely, shaping her emerging nature according to a predetermined template." Adrian watched Isabella's brown eyes flicker between human consciousness and predatory gold, her face contorting with pain as her body rebuilt itself at the cellular level. During brief moments of clarity, she would look at him with desperate gratitude for the sanctuary he'd provided. But then the corruption would surge through her system again, and her features would twist with an alien hunger that belonged to someone else entirely. Sarah's analysis confirmed Adrian's worst fears about what Marcus had learned during his supposed death. Your brother has discovered how to bind vampires during the turning process, Sarah continued, her voice carrying centuries of hard-won knowledge. The old covens used similar techniques before the Great Purge, creating armies of enslaved vampires who couldn't disobey their master's commands. If Marcus has perfected those forbidden arts, then every vampire he creates becomes an extension of his will, rather than an independent being. The implications struck Adrian like physical blows. A bound vampire couldn't refuse orders, couldn't choose their own path, couldn't even truly die without their master's permission. It represented everything vampire society had fought to eliminate, the kind of slavery that had once threatened to tear their species apart in civil wars that lasted centuries. Isabella convulsed again, her back arching as another wave of transformation pain racked her frame, and Adrian could see the moment when Marcus's influence tried to assert itself over her consciousness. Her eyes would go completely blank, her face assuming an expression of cold calculation that belonged to someone else entirely, before her human will reasserted itself and she would scream with the agony of resisting mental domination. While Sarah monitored Isabella's condition, Adrian dispatched his 3 best trackers to investigate the museum where the attack had occurred. Vampire trackers were legendary for their ability to follow trails days or even weeks old, their supernatural senses capable of detecting the faintest traces of blood, fear, or supernatural corruption. They returned within hours with news that made Adrian's centuries-old blood run cold, with recognition of a larger conspiracy. The museum basement where Isabella had been working showed signs of multiple vampire visits over the past month, scent trails that suggested Marcus hadn't chosen his victim randomly but had been stalking the facility for weeks, studying its employees and security patterns with the patience of a predator who had learned to plan centuries ahead. But the most disturbing discovery came from the museum's personnel records and security footage. 7 other employees had vanished over the past month, all of them specialists in medieval history or ancient artifacts, all of them working late shifts that left them isolated and vulnerable. The security cameras had captured their final moments, showing each victim leaving willingly, with a silver-haired man, whose face never quite turned toward the recording devices, as if he possessed some supernatural ability to avoid being clearly documented. They walked out of the museum under their own power, smiling and chatting with their companion, as if meeting an old friend. But none of them had returned home that night, or been seen since their disappearances. Adrian studied the security footage with growing horror, recognizing Marcus's predatory patience in the careful selection of victims. His brother wasn't creating random vampires for sport or feeding, wasn't giving in to bloodlust or supernatural hunger. This was recruitment, systematic and methodical, targeting individuals with specific knowledge and skills that would be valuable in whatever larger plan Marcus was orchestrating. Medieval historians who would understand ancient vampire laws and customs, artifact specialists who could identify and handle supernatural relics, researchers who had spent their careers studying the exact kind of historical documents that contained the deepest secrets of vampire society. Isabella had been meant as something more than just another bound vampire, Adrian realized with chilling clarity. Her expertise in art restoration, her access to museum archives containing centuries of carefully hidden supernatural artifacts, her knowledge of authentication techniques that could verify the age and provenance of ancient vampire relics, all of it made her invaluable to someone planning to challenge the established order. Marcus hadn't just been creating an army, he'd been building a specialized force of bound vampires, with the exact skills needed to undermine everything Adrian had constructed over the past century. The corruption in Isabella's bite mark pulsed with renewed intensity as if responding to Adrian's understanding of Marcus's plan, and she screamed with a voice that carried harmonics no human throat could produce. Her fingernails extended into claws that carved deep gouges in the midnight oak bedframe, and when she looked at Adrian again, her eyes blazed with predatory intelligence that belonged entirely to someone else. The binding is almost complete, Sarah warned, her own considerable power manifesting as silver flames around her fingertips. If we don't break Marcus's hold soon, she'll become his lieutenant whether she wants to or not, with all her knowledge and skills turned to his purposes. During brief interludes between the waves of transformation agony, Isabella managed to speak in fragmented whispers that revealed disturbing truths about what Marcus had told her during the attack. He knew things about the peace treaty that should have been classified at the highest levels of both vampire and human governments, details about secret clauses and hidden provisions that Adrian himself had negotiated in private meetings with human leadership. Marcus had whispered about anti-vampire research programs being conducted in government facilities, about weapons designed specifically to kill supernatural beings, about human scientists who were studying captured vampire blood to develop new forms of biological warfare. "The human government knows about us," Isabella gasped during one moment of clarity, her human consciousness fighting to surface through Marcus's mental domination. "They've always known, since before the treaty was signed. Your brother showed me documents, photographs of laboratories where they're experimenting on vampire blood, trying to create weapons that can kill your entire species. He said the peace treaty was never about protection, it was about control, keeping vampires docile while humans develop the means to exterminate you entirely." Adrian felt the careful foundations of his worldview cracking like ice in spring. If Isabella's fragmentary revelations were accurate, if Marcus possessed evidence of human betrayal at the highest levels of government, then everything Adrian had built over the past century was compromised from its very foundations. The peace treaty he'd negotiated in good faith, the careful balance he'd maintained between vampire survival and human security, the political alliances he'd forged with human leadership, all of it might have been built on lies and deception from the very beginning. The next morning, Adrian requested an emergency meeting with Director Morgan Hayes, his primary human liaison in the treaty organization. Hayes was a career diplomat who had inherited his position from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him, creating a dynastic succession that had maintained continuity in vampire-human relations for 3 generations. They met in a glass-walled government building that gleamed with morning sunlight, its transparent walls symbolizing the openness and transparency that supposedly characterized the modern treaty relationship. Though Adrian noticed for the first time how the building's design would trap any vampire visitor in a cage of deadly illumination if the protective filters were ever removed. Hayes appeared nervous in ways Adrian had never observed before, his usually steady hands trembling slightly as he poured coffee from a silver service that Adrian now recognized might have been chosen specifically for its supernatural significance. "Director," Adrian said without preamble, his silver eyes reflecting the morning light, like mirrors, "I need to know about the classified research programs your government has been conducting on vampire physiology and supernatural biology." Hayes nearly dropped his coffee cup, the liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim as his face went pale with the shock of having state secrets exposed so directly. The silence stretched between them like a wire under tension until Hayes finally set down his cup with exaggerated care and met Adrian's gaze with the expression of a man who realized his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. "The research is purely defensive," Hayes said carefully, his diplomatic training warring with the obvious impossibility of denying what Adrian somehow already knew. After the treaty wars, after seeing what unchecked vampire populations could do to human civilization, our governments needed to understand the threat level we were dealing with. The weapons development, the biological studies, all of it is designed to provide deterrent capability, not aggressive action. Adrian leaned forward across the conference table, his supernatural presence filling the room like a physical weight that made the air itself seem denser and more oppressive. "You've been lying to me for over a century," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that had once made human kings beg for mercy. Every negotiation, every treaty revision, every assurance of mutual cooperation, all of it built on deception, while your scientists worked to develop weapons capable of vampire genocide. Hayes tried to maintain his diplomatic composure, but Adrian could smell the fear sweat beginning to bead on his forehead, could hear his heart rate accelerating with the terror of a prey animal who suddenly realized it was trapped in a room with an apex predator. The weapons exist as insurance only, Hayes insisted, though his voice lacked the conviction his words tried to project. Orbital platforms with UV laser arrays, airborne biological agents designed to target vampire physiology, electromagnetic pulse devices that disrupt supernatural nervous systems. But they've never been deployed, never been used against vampire populations, never even been tested outside of laboratory conditions. They're a last resort, a fail-safe in case the treaty system ever completely breaks down and we face the kind of supernatural war that could end human civilization. Adrian absorbed this confirmation of his worst fears with outward calm, while inside his mind raced through implications and countermeasures. If humans possessed orbital weapons capable of targeting vampire strongholds with concentrated ultraviolet radiation, if they had developed biological agents specifically designed to kill supernatural beings, then the peace treaty wasn't a partnership between equals, but a carefully maintained fiction that allowed humans to keep vampires contained while they developed the means for total extermination. Every vampire haven, every supernatural sanctuary, every carefully negotiated safe zone existed only at human sufferance and could be eliminated at any moment if human leadership decided the treaty was no longer serving their interests. When Adrian returned to the obsidian fortress that evening, his mind still reeling from the revelations of human deception and the growing evidence that Marcus's rebellion might be based on legitimate grievances rather than simple megalomaniacal ambition, he discovered that Isabella had vanished from her warded chambers. The protective spells that should have contained even the most powerful newly turned vampire had been shattered from within, their silver light extinguished and their binding energies scattered like broken glass across the midnight oak floor. Sarah stood amid the wreckage, looking shaken in ways Adrian had never seen before, her ancient composure cracked by the impossibility of what had occurred. She broke through wards that have contained vampires for 8 centuries, Sarah reported, her voice tight with disbelief and growing alarm. The binding Marcus placed on her is stronger than anything we've encountered before, strong enough to override our most powerful containment spells. But there's something else, something that doesn't make sense. The way she escaped, the precision of how she shattered the ward matrix, it suggests she retained enough of her own will to choose when and how to break free, rather than simply responding to Marcus's remote commands. Adrian stared at the empty bed where Isabella had lain just hours before, at the torn restraints and shattered protective runes that should have kept her safe while they found a way to break Marcus's hold over her consciousness. The timing of her escape, coming so soon after his meeting with Hayes and his discovery of human betrayal at the highest levels of government, suggested that Marcus's network of bound vampires was larger and more sophisticated than anyone had imagined, capable of coordinating actions across the city in response to changing political circumstances. If Marcus knew about Adrian's meeting with the human leadership, if his bound vampires were providing him with real-time intelligence about treaty negotiations and government responses, then the Vampire King's brother possessed capabilities that made him more dangerous than any enemy Adrian had faced in 8 centuries of existence. The hunt for Isabella and the larger war against Marcus's growing rebellion had begun in earnest, but Adrian now understood that the stakes were higher than family rivalry or political rebellion. If the peace treaty collapsed, if the careful balance between vampire survival and human security finally shattered under the weight of mutual deception and accumulated grievances, then both species might face extinction in a war that would leave the world itself transformed beyond recognition. Isabella's consciousness returned like a tide washing over broken glass, each fragment of awareness cutting through the fog that had clouded her mind since the transformation began. She found herself lying on cold stone in what had once been a magnificent cathedral, its soaring Gothic arches now cracked and weathered by decades of abandonment, its stained glass windows shattered into rainbow fragments that carpeted the floor like fallen tears. The air tasted of dust and decay, of old incense and older blood, and when she tried to move, she discovered her wrists were bound with chains that hummed with supernatural energy, their links inscribed with runes that burned against her skin whenever she tested their strength. But the physical restraints were nothing compared to the presence that filled the ruined sanctuary, a cold intelligence that pressed against her thoughts like fingers made of winter darkness. Marcus Blackthorne stood before the altar where a crucifix had once hung, his silver hair catching the moonlight that streamed through the broken rose window behind him. His face was Adrian's face, but twisted by centuries of cruelty and resentment. The same aristocratic features made sharp and predatory by experiences that had carved away every trace of compassion or mercy. His eyes were the same pale silver as his brother's, but they held depths of malice that made Isabella's newly awakened vampire instincts recoil with primitive fear, recognizing something that had moved beyond mere predator into the realm of absolute monster. When he smiled at her awakening, his fangs gleamed like polished ivory in the darkness, and she could see that they had been filed to needle points, designed not just to pierce, but to tear and rend. "Welcome back to consciousness, my dear Isabella," Marcus said, his voice carrying the cultured accent of medieval nobility overlaid with something that made the cathedral's remaining stone angels seem to weep. "You've been sleeping for 3 days while your transformation completed itself, while my blood worked its way through your system and reshaped you according to my design rather than nature's chaotic whims." He moved with fluid grace that spoke of centuries of supernatural speed and strength, circling her bound form like a wolf examining trapped prey. "Your new existence is bound to my will in ways that even the oldest vampires would find impressive, but I've allowed you to retain enough of your original personality to make you useful rather than simply obedient." Isabella tested the chains again, feeling her enhanced strength strain against metal that refused to yield, and Marcus laughed with genuine amusement at her futile struggle. Those bonds were forged in the 13th century by vampire smiths, who understood the art of containing our kind, he explained, settling onto a broken pew with casual elegance. "They've held creatures far older and more powerful than you, my newly made daughter. Though I suspect you're beginning to understand just how much your capabilities have expanded since our first meeting in that musty museum basement. Can you feel it, Isabella? The way your senses have sharpened until you can hear the heartbeats of rats in the walls, smell the fear of sleeping humans 6 blocks away, see in absolute darkness as clearly as blazing daylight?" The sensory enhancement was overwhelming, a constant flood of information that threatened to drown her consciousness in details no human mind was designed to process. She could indeed hear the tiny hearts of creatures scurrying through the cathedral's walls, could smell the complex, layered scents of the city carried on night breezes, could see Marcus's face with perfect clarity, despite the darkness that should have rendered him invisible. But beneath the intoxicating rush of supernatural ability, she felt the constant pressure of his will against her thoughts, a mental presence that whispered suggestions and commands in voices that sounded almost like her own internal monologue. Marcus rose from the pew and approached the altar, where Isabella now noticed dozens of artifacts arranged with ritualistic precision. Ancient books bound in leather that looked disturbingly like human skin, chalices carved from what appeared to be human skulls, and daggers whose blades seemed to drink in the moonlight rather than reflect it. But the centerpiece of the collection was a crystalline orb the size of a human head, its surface swirling with internal fire that pulsed in rhythm with Isabella's own heartbeat. The sight of it filled her with inexplicable dread, as if some deep part of her vampire nature recognized the artifact as something that should never be disturbed. "You've been chosen for a very special purpose, my dear," Marcus continued, his fingers tracing patterns in the air above the crystal orb that made its internal fire flare with renewed intensity. "Your expertise in art restoration and authentication, your access to museum archives containing centuries of carefully hidden supernatural artifacts, your knowledge of historical research techniques, all of it makes you invaluable to the great work I've been planning for over a century. But more than that, your transformation serves a symbolic purpose that will force my dear brother Adrian to confront truths he's spent centuries trying to avoid." The pressure in Isabella's mind intensified, and suddenly she found herself standing without conscious decision, the chains falling away as if they had never been locked. Her body moved with fluid grace that belonged more to Marcus than to herself, stepping toward the altar where the artifacts waited with malevolent patience. She tried to resist, tried to assert control over her own movements, but the binding Marcus had placed on her during the transformation ran deeper than mere physical compulsion. It was woven into the very structure of her supernatural existence, making disobedience not just difficult, but nearly inconceivable. "Adrian has forgotten what we truly are," Marcus said, his voice taking on the cadence of a sermon delivered in this same cathedral centuries before its abandonment. "He's spent so long playing politician, so many decades balancing vampire survival against human comfort, that he's lost sight of our fundamental nature. We are apex predators, Isabella, creatures designed by evolution and supernatural forces to hunt and feed and dominate lesser species. The peace treaty he's so proud of isn't protection, it's capitulation, a surrender of our birthright in exchange for the illusion of safety." Marcus gestured toward the cathedral's broken windows, beyond which the city sprawled in all directions like a vast feeding ground. Out there, millions of humans sleep peacefully in their beds, never knowing that creatures capable of tearing them apart with bare hands walk among them every night. They've grown fat and complacent under Adrian's protection, forgotten the healthy fear their ancestors felt when they whispered stories about things that hunted in the darkness. The peace treaty has made them weak, made them forget their proper place in the natural order. And it's made us weak as well, dependent on their tolerance instead of their terror. The binding compulsion guided Isabella's hands to the crystal orb, and the moment her fingers made contact with its surface, visions flooded her consciousness with overwhelming intensity. She saw the peace treaty as it had been signed over a century ago, watched Adrian and human diplomats putting their signatures to documents that glowed with binding magic designed to prevent either species from completely destroying the other. But she also saw the secret clauses, the hidden provisions that gave humans permission to develop anti-vampire weapons as long as they were never deployed, and the carefully worded loopholes that would allow treaty termination if certain conditions were met. The orb was called the Crimson Codex, Marcus explained, as Isabella's visions continued, and it was one of the most powerful vampire artifacts ever created, a crystallized repository of blood magic that contained the binding spells used to enforce supernatural treaties for over 2,000 years. With it, he could unravel the magical foundations that kept the peace treaty intact, could break the supernatural bonds that prevented vampires from embracing their true nature as humanity's natural predators. But the Codex was heavily protected, hidden somewhere in Adrian's obsidian fortress, behind wards that had never been breached in 8 centuries of existence. "That's where you become essential to my plans, my dear Isabella," Marcus said, his mental presence wrapping around her thoughts like silk chains that grew tighter with every breath. "Your transformation will force Adrian to grant you access to his inner circle, will make him trust you with secrets he's guarded for centuries, will give you opportunities to map his defenses and identify weaknesses that even I couldn't discover in decades of careful observation. You'll become my eyes and ears inside his stronghold, my weapon aimed at the very heart of his carefully constructed political empire." Isabella fought against the compulsion with every fragment of will she could summon, but the binding was too strong, too thoroughly integrated into her supernatural existence. Instead of open rebellion, she found herself asking questions that seemed to emerge from her own curiosity but carried undertones of Marcus's strategic interest. How can you be sure Adrian will trust me after I escaped from his fortress? How do you know he won't recognize your influence over my actions? How can you guarantee I'll be able to find and steal the Crimson Codex without triggering the defensive wards? Marcus's laughter filled the ruined cathedral like the sound of breaking glass, and Isabella realized her questions had revealed exactly how completely she was bound to his will. Even her attempts at resistance were serving his purposes, providing him with information about her concerns and motivations that would help him refine his control over her actions. "My dear child," he said, with paternal condescension that made her skin crawl, "you underestimate both my planning and Adrian's predictable nobility. He'll take you back because he believes in redemption, because he thinks love and patience can overcome any supernatural compulsion, because his human sympathies have made him forget that some bonds can never be broken by wishful thinking alone." But before Isabella could infiltrate Adrian's stronghold, Marcus wanted to demonstrate the true extent of his power and the futility of resistance to his will. He led her from the cathedral into the city's abandoned subway tunnels, where she discovered he had been building an army that made Adrian's worst fears seem conservative by comparison. Dozens of vampires moved through the darkness with coordinated precision, their eyes glowing with the same golden fire that marked them as Marcus's bound creations. They were hunting, she realized with growing horror, and their prey consisted of the city's homeless population, people who wouldn't be missed, whose disappearances wouldn't trigger police investigations or media attention. "Join them," Marcus commanded, and Isabella felt her body respond before her mind could formulate any protest. She moved with inhuman speed through the tunnel system, her enhanced senses guiding her toward the scent of human blood and human fear. The hunt was intoxicating in ways that terrified her, awakening predatory instincts she'd never suspected existed, making her understand why vampires had once ruled the night through terror rather than treaties. When she caught her assigned prey, an elderly homeless man who had been sleeping in an abandoned maintenance alcove, she felt Marcus's satisfaction flowing through their mental connection like poisoned honey. But in the moment when her fangs pierced the man's throat, when his blood flowed across her tongue with flavors that seemed to awaken every cell in her transformed body, Isabella experienced a flash of clarity that cut through Marcus's mental dominance like a blade through shadow. She saw herself as she truly was, not Marcus's weapon or Adrian's responsibility, but a woman who had been given power beyond human imagination and now faced the choice of how to use it. The binding compulsion couldn't eliminate her free will entirely, she realized. It could only make resistance more difficult and more painful. But if she was clever, if she was patient, if she was willing to endure suffering that would break a human mind, she might be able to turn Marcus's own power against him when the moment came for her to choose between his vision of vampire supremacy and something that preserved both her humanity and her supernatural nature. The realization came with a cost that left her gasping in agony as Marcus's binding spells reasserted themselves, punishing her moment of independent thought with pain that felt like molten silver flowing through her veins. But the knowledge remained, hidden beneath layers of compulsion and conditioning, waiting for the right moment to emerge and reshape the balance of power between the brothers, whose conflict threatened to destroy everything both species had worked to build. Isabella had become Marcus's weapon, but weapons sometimes turned in their wielder's hands, and she intended to make sure that when the final confrontation came, she would be pointing in the right direction. The obsidian fortress trembled with tension that had nothing to do with seismic activity and everything to do with supernatural power barely held in check as Adrian's council convened in the ancient war room where vampire nobility had debated matters of life and death for 8 centuries. Lord Cassius rose from his throne of carved bone, his gaunt frame draped in ceremonial robes that had been old when Rome fell, his pale eyes blazing with the cold fury of a creature who had witnessed the rise and fall of human empires while remaining unchanged by the passage of time. The eldest council member's voice carried the weight of absolute authority as he spoke, each word carefully measured and delivered with the precision of a blade finding its target. Marcus Blackthorn is a cancer that threatens to destroy everything we have built, Cassius declared, his ancient hands gripping the armrests of his throne until the bone creaked under supernatural strength. Every moment we delay his execution is another moment for his corruption to spread, another opportunity for him to create more bound vampires, another step closer to the complete collapse of the treaty system that protects both our species from mutual annihilation. Lady Morgana unfolded from her position in the shadows like darkness given form, her midnight hair flowing around shoulders bare except for the silver chains that marked her status as the council's military advisor. Her beauty was the kind that had inspired human poets to madness and human armies to war. But her eyes held depths of strategic thinking that had guided vampire survival through the darkest periods of their history. She moved with liquid grace to the center of the chamber, her presence commanding attention from every assembled noble as she prepared to voice the heretical thoughts that had been growing in the minds of the more pragmatic council members. Perhaps, she said, her voice carrying undertones that made even Cassius pause in his righteous fury. We should consider that Marcus might not be entirely wrong about the fundamental problems with our current situation. Human technology has advanced exponentially in the past century, and their weapons development programs have reached the point where they could theoretically eliminate our entire species without risking a single human life. The council chamber erupted in shocked murmurs and angry protests, but Morgana raised her hand for silence and continued her dangerous argument. Orbital laser platforms capable of flooding entire cities with concentrated ultraviolet radiation, biological weapons designed specifically to target vampire physiology, electromagnetic pulse devices that can disrupt our supernatural nervous systems, all of these exist and could be deployed at any moment if human leadership decides the treaty is no longer serving their interests. We've traded our position as apex predators for the promise of safety, but what happens when that safety becomes a cage from which there is no escape? Adrian listened to the debate with growing unease, understanding that both perspectives contained dangerous truths that could lead vampire society toward catastrophic decisions. Cassius represented the traditionalist faction that viewed the peace treaty as sacrosanct, the foundation upon which modern vampire civilization had been built, while Morgana spoke for the pragmatists who worried that their species had become too dependent on human tolerance to survive, if that tolerance ever evaporated. Between them lay the terrible possibility that Marcus's rebellion might succeed, not through superior force, but through the simple expedient of revealing truths that would shatter the careful illusions keeping both species from each other's throats. The king found himself caught between impossible choices, each path leading toward potential disaster for millions of innocent lives. Protecting Isabella meant defying his own counsel and potentially allowing Marcus to complete whatever plan required her specialized knowledge and supernatural abilities. Hunting Marcus immediately might prevent larger catastrophe, but would also condemn Isabella to eternal slavery under her creator's mental domination. And underlying both dilemmas was the growing evidence that the peace treaty itself might be built on foundations too weak to support the weight of mutual mistrust and competing survival interests. As the council debate raged around him, Adrian felt the supernatural bond he'd established with Isabella during her rescue pulling at his consciousness like a silver thread stretched to its breaking point. Through their connection, he could sense her distress as the corruption in Marcus's bite spread through her system like liquid fire, carrying with it fragments of memory and intention that belonged to her creator rather than herself. The visions came to her in waves of overwhelming intensity, showing her centuries of Marcus's existence as a creature driven by resentment and hunger for power that had consumed every trace of the brother Adrian remembered from their mortal lives. She saw Marcus in medieval forests, hunting human travelers with casual cruelty that went far beyond the necessity of feeding. She witnessed his first attempts at creating bound vampires, experiments in blood magic that left his victims twisted into something that retained human consciousness while being completely subservient to his will. She experienced his growing resentment toward Adrian's rise to power, the bitter jealousy that festered over decades of watching his younger brother command respect and loyalty that Marcus believed should have been his by right of age and superior strength. And she saw his ultimate plan unfolding like a map of conquest drawn in blood and suffering, a vision of vampire supremacy that would reduce humanity to nothing more than cattle to be harvested at will. The corruption spreading from Marcus's bite wasn't just transforming Isabella's body, it was connecting her consciousness to his in ways that revealed the true scope of his ambitions. He didn't simply want to break the peace treaty or overthrow Adrian's government. He wanted to remake vampire society itself according to his vision of predatory dominance. The bound vampires he'd been creating weren't just an army, they were the prototype for a new kind of vampire civilization where free will existed only at the apex of the power structure and everyone else served as extensions of their master's will. It was slavery refined to supernatural perfection, a system that would ensure no future rebellion could ever challenge the established order. But through the unwilling mental connection, Isabella also discovered information that made her transformation into a weapon against Adrian seem almost secondary to Marcus's larger strategy. Hidden beneath the city's main cathedral, in consecrated catacombs that should have burned any vampire who dared enter their sacred precincts, Marcus had established his primary stronghold and laboratory. The holy ground itself had been corrupted through rituals of blood magic so profane that they had turned sanctified earth into something that welcomed rather than repelled supernatural darkness. There, surrounded by the remains of saints and martyrs, he had been conducting experiments that went beyond simple vampire creation into realms of dark sorcery that would have horrified even the ancient covens that had once practiced blood magic as a matter of course. Adrian felt Isabella's revulsion and terror through their bond as she experienced Marcus's memories of desecrating consecrated ground, of turning places of worship into laboratories for supernatural horror. The missing museum employees were there, she realized with growing anguish, transformed into Marcus's bound servants, but retaining enough of their original personalities to suffer endlessly as they carried out tasks that violated everything they had once believed about human dignity and worth. They had become living illustrations of Marcus's philosophy, conscious beings reduced to the status of tools, their expertise in medieval history and ancient artifacts perverted to serve purposes they would have found abominable in their human lives. The location of Marcus's stronghold explained how he had been able to operate undetected for so long. The cathedral catacombs stretched for miles beneath the city, connecting to sewer systems and abandoned subway tunnels that provided unlimited access to the surface while remaining hidden from both human authorities and vampire surveillance. The consecrated ground should have made the location uninhabitable for any vampire, but Marcus's corruption of the Holy Earth had turned the catacombs into something that existed outside normal supernatural law, a pocket of twisted reality where the usual rules governing vampire existence no longer applied. Adrian made his decision with the kind of instantaneous clarity that had made him a king and kept him alive for 8 centuries. Rising from his throne with fluid grace that silenced the arguing council, he announced his intention to lead a strike team into the cathedral catacombs before Marcus could complete whatever ritual required Isabella's presence and cooperation. Lucian stepped forward immediately, his loyalty to Adrian transcending any concerns about the mission's obvious dangers, while Sarah emerged from the shadows with weapons that hummed with protective enchantments designed to function in consecrated ground. But Adrian knew that their supernatural abilities would be severely limited in truly holy places, that they would be fighting Marcus on ground he had spent decades preparing and fortifying, against exactly this kind of assault. The descent into the cathedral catacombs began through a hidden entrance in the cemetery behind the main church, a stone stairway that spiraled down into darkness thick enough to swallow even vampire vision. The air grew progressively heavier as they descended, laden with the scent of old incense mixed with something far more disturbing, the metallic tang of spilled blood and the sweet corruption of flesh that had been dead too long. The walls were lined with niches containing the bones of saints and martyrs, but Adrian could see that many of the remains had been disturbed, arranged in patterns that served purposes far removed from religious reverence or respect for the dead. As they penetrated deeper into the catacomb system, following passages that seemed to stretch into the earth's very heart, Adrian began to understand the true scope of Marcus's violations against both human and vampire law. The consecrated ground had indeed been corrupted, its holy nature twisted into something that welcomed supernatural darkness while retaining enough sanctified power to provide protection from outside interference. It was blood magic of the most sophisticated kind, requiring centuries of careful preparation and the sacrifice of innocents in numbers that would have shocked even the most ruthless vampire lords of the ancient era. The confrontation came suddenly, without warning or preamble, as Marcus emerged from shadows that seemed deeper than mere absence of light. His silver hair gleamed in the torchlight that flickered from sconces carved into catacomb walls, and his face wore an expression of paternal amusement as he regarded his younger brother's strike team. "Welcome to my sanctuary, dear Adrian," Marcus said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the very stones around them resonate with sympathetic vibration. "I've been expecting you, of course, though I must admit surprise at how long it took you to track me to this holy ground that no longer recognizes the distinction between sacred and profane." Isabella stood beside Marcus like a puppet whose strings were visible only to supernatural perception, her eyes blank with the kind of absolute mental domination that reduced conscious beings to extensions of another's will. But Adrian could sense through their bond that some fragment of her original personality remained trapped beneath Marcus's control, screaming silently as she was forced to participate in actions that violated every principle she had once held dear. The corruption in her bite mark had spread until it covered half her throat in a pattern of black veins that pulsed with malevolent energy, and Adrian realized that her transformation into one of Marcus's bound servants was nearly complete. The battle that followed stripped away 8 centuries of political sophistication and diplomatic restraint, reducing both brothers to the predatory essence that lay beneath their civilized facades. Adrian fought with skills honed through millennia of supernatural conflict, his blade singing through air thick with the scent of spilled blood and violated sanctity, while Marcus matched him move for move with techniques that had been refined through decades of secret practice and planning. But the corrupted holy ground gave Marcus advantages that went beyond superior preparation, allowing him to draw power from the desecrated remains of saints while limiting Adrian's access to the supernatural abilities that had made him legendary among vampire nobility. The true horror of Marcus's stronghold became apparent as the fight raged through chamber after chamber of the catacomb system. The missing museum employees were indeed there, transformed into bound vampires, but retaining enough of their original personalities to suffer constant anguish as they carried out Marcus's commands. They moved with coordinated precision that spoke of absolute mental domination, their faces bearing expressions of endless despair as they performed tasks that required their specialized knowledge while violating everything they had once believed about human dignity and scholarly ethics. They were living proof of Marcus's philosophy, conscious beings reduced to the status of sophisticated tools, their expertise perverted to serve purposes they found abominable but were powerless to resist. Adrian realized with growing horror that his brother hadn't simply survived the execution of 127 years ago. He had been transformed by it into something that went beyond ordinary vampire nature. Marcus had become a creature that fed not just on blood, but on suffering itself, drawing sustenance from the anguish of his bound servants in ways that made him stronger and more dangerous with each act of cruelty he forced them to commit. The execution had broken something fundamental in his nature, turning him into a predator that hunted consciousness itself rather than mere flesh and blood. The confrontation reached its climax when Marcus used Isabella's mental bond as a weapon, forcing her to attack Adrian while he retreated toward the catacomb's deepest chamber where something pulsed with power that made the air itself seem to thicken and writhe. Adrian found himself fighting the woman he had sworn to protect. Her enhanced vampire abilities turned against him, while her human consciousness screamed helplessly behind eyes that blazed with borrowed malice. He could feel her terror and revulsion through their bond, could sense her desperate attempts to resist Marcus's control, but the binding was too strong and too thoroughly integrated into her supernatural existence. In the deepest chamber of the corrupted catacombs, surrounded by the desecrated remains of Christian martyrs and the twisted artifacts of perverted blood magic, Marcus retrieved the Crimson Codex from its hiding place within what had once been a saint's tomb. The ancient artifact pulsed with power that sent shockwaves through both the physical and spiritual realms, its crystalline surface swirling with energies that could unravel the magical foundations of every supernatural treaty that had ever been signed. As Marcus raised the codex above his head in triumphant possession, Adrian understood that his brother's rebellion had moved beyond family rivalry into territory that threatened the existence of both vampire and human civilizations, and that the final confrontation between them would determine whether either species survived the war that was about to engulf the world. The Crimson Codex blazed with power that turned Marcus's eyes to silver fire as he raised the ancient artifact above the altar of desecrated saints, its crystalline surface reflecting fragments of light that had no earthly source while resonating with harmonics that made the very bones in the catacomb walls vibrate in sympathetic response. Adrian watched in horror as his brother began the ritual to sever the magical bonds holding the peace treaty together, speaking words in the old tongue that predated human civilization and carried the weight of vampire law stretching back to the species' earliest nights. The air itself seemed to thicken and writhe as Marcus drew upon power that had been locked away for centuries. The Codex channeling energies that existed at the intersection of blood magic and political sorcery, forces that could reshape the supernatural landscape according to the will of whoever possessed sufficient knowledge and ruthlessness to wield them properly. Isabella collapsed to her knees as the ritual's opening phrases sent shockwaves through the mental bond Marcus had forged with her during the transformation. Her consciousness caught between her own desperate attempts to maintain independent thought and the overwhelming tide of power flowing through their connection like molten silver through her veins. Adrian could feel her agony through their own bond, could sense the way Marcus's ritual was using her as a living conduit for energies that would have incinerated any normal vampire within moments of contact. The corruption spreading from her bite mark pulsed with renewed intensity, black veins racing across her skin in patterns that matched the runes carved into the codex's crystalline surface, turning her into a living extension of the artifact's power while slowly burning away everything that made her human. The magical backlash from the ritual's initiation rippled outward from the corrupted catacombs like an earthquake in the spiritual realm, sending shockwaves through every supernatural ward and protective barrier within 100 miles of the city. Vampire strongholds throughout the region trembled as their defensive enchantments flickered and dimmed, their ancient protections suddenly uncertain in the face of power that called into question the very foundations upon which modern supernatural society had been built. Human psychics and practitioners of minor magic found themselves overwhelmed by visions of darkness spreading across the world like spilled blood, while sensitive individuals who had never experienced anything more supernatural than unusually vivid dreams suddenly found themselves seeing through vampire eyes and tasting phantom blood on their tongues. Adrian faced the most agonizing choice of his 8th-century existence as he watched Isabella's life force being consumed by Marcus's ritual, while his brother continued the complex invocations that would shatter the peace treaty's magical foundations. He could pursue Marcus immediately, could attempt to stop the ritual before it reached the point of irreversible momentum, but doing so would mean abandoning Isabella to die, as Marcus drained her essence to fuel his spell. Or he could save the woman who had become far more important to him than political considerations should have allowed. But that choice would give Marcus the time he needed to complete the ritual and plunge both species into a war that could end with the extinction of everyone Adrian had spent centuries trying to protect. The decision came with the kind of instantaneous clarity that had made Adrian a king, as he chose love over duty for perhaps the first time in his immortal existence. He reached Isabella in a blur of supernatural speed, gathering her convulsing form into his arms, while Marcus's laughter echoed through the catacomb chambers like the sound of breaking glass. "My dear brother," Marcus called out without pausing in his ritual invocations, "how perfectly predictable that you would choose sentiment over strategy, personal attachment over political necessity. You always were too human for your own good, too willing to let emotions override the cold calculation required for true leadership." Adrian ignored his brother's taunts as he bit into his own wrist, offering Isabella his ancient blood in a desperate attempt to stabilize her condition before Marcus's ritual could consume what remained of her life force. The moment their blood mixed, Adrian felt the connection between them deepen into something that transcended the normal bonds between vampire creator and progeny, their consciousness merging in ways that allowed Isabella to experience fragments of his centuries-long existence, while he gained access to her memories of Marcus's corruption and manipulation. Through their shared awareness, she experienced the weight of leadership that had shaped every decision Adrian had made since assuming the throne, the constant balance between vampire survival and human protection that had defined his reign, the terrible loneliness of making choices that affected millions of lives while having no one who truly understood the burden he carried. The blood sharing created an unexpected side effect, as Isabella's consciousness merged temporarily with Adrian's accumulated memories, allowing her to see the peace treaty's creation from his perspective and understand the true cost of the political balance he had maintained for over a century. She experienced his negotiations with human leadership, his careful cultivation of relationships that kept both species from each other's throats, his constant vigilance against extremists on both sides who would prefer war to the difficult work of coexistence. But she also saw the moments of doubt that had plagued him throughout the decades, the growing evidence that some humans viewed the treaty as nothing more than a temporary expedient while they developed weapons capable of vampire genocide, and the fear that his commitment to peace might ultimately doom the very people he was trying to protect. As Isabella's condition stabilized under the influence of Adrian's ancient blood, Director Hayes's voice crackled through the emergency communication device Adrian carried for treaty-related crises. The magical disturbances caused by Marcus's ritual had been detected by human monitoring systems around the world, their sophisticated instruments interpreting the supernatural energy surges as evidence of a coordinated vampire attack on human population centers. Military forces were mobilizing with the kind of speed that suggested they had been planning for this contingency for years. And Hayes's voice carried the strain of a man who realized he was watching the careful work of generations collapse into chaos within a matter of hours. "You have 48 hours, Hayes said, his words clipped with the precision of someone delivering an ultimatum rather than opening negotiations. "The orbital laser platforms will achieve targeting solutions on every known vampire haven within 2 days, and the biological weapon satellites will be authorized for deployment if we don't receive absolute confirmation that this magical assault has been terminated." The peace treaty contains automatic retaliation clauses that activate when human populations are threatened by supernatural attack, and what's happening right now meets every criteria for total response authorization. Adrian felt the trap closing around him with the inexorability of a mechanical device designed by someone who understood exactly how he would respond to each successive crisis. Marcus had planned this cascade of disasters with the patience and precision of a creature who had spent decades studying his brother's psychology, knowing that Adrian's commitment to protecting both species would force him into impossible choices that served Marcus's larger strategy, regardless of which option he selected. Breaking the peace treaty wasn't just about freeing vampires from human oversight. It was about triggering the automatic military response that would justify Marcus's philosophy of vampire supremacy, while simultaneously eliminating most of Adrian's political allies and moderate voices on both sides. The orbital weapons Hayes described weren't theoretical deterrents. They were operational systems that could flood entire cities with concentrated ultraviolet radiation, turning vampire strongholds into crematoriums within minutes of activation. The biological weapons were even more insidious, airborne agents designed to target the specific genetic markers that differentiated vampire physiology from human biology, capable of eliminating every supernatural being on the planet while leaving human populations completely unaffected. It was genocide refined to scientific precision, and Marcus had known that breaking the treaty would activate protocols that would do his work for him while allowing him to claim he was defending vampire survival against human aggression. Isabella's enhanced consciousness, now permanently linked to Adrian's through their shared blood, allowed her to perceive Marcus's location and intentions with a clarity that went beyond normal supernatural senses. Her connection to her creator hadn't been severed by Adrian's intervention. It had been transformed into something she could use as a tracking mechanism while maintaining enough independence to resist Marcus's direct mental control. Through the twisted bond that still linked her to her first creator, she could sense that Marcus had abandoned the corrupted catacombs and retreated to an even more secure location, somewhere that carried resonances of ancient power and vampire history that predated the modern era by centuries. "He's gone to the original vampire court," Isabella whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that belonged neither to her human past nor her vampire present, but to something new that had emerged from her connection to both Adrian and Marcus. The old stronghold beneath the city's founding district, where vampire kings ruled before the Great Treaty reshaped our world. It's been abandoned for over 2 centuries, but Marcus has been preparing it as his final sanctuary, the place where he intends to complete the right of dominion and bind every vampire in existence to his will. Adrian's blood turned to ice at the mention of the right of dominion, a ritual so dangerous and morally abhorrent that knowledge of its existence had been suppressed by vampire leadership for over a millennium. The ceremony would allow Marcus to extend his mental control beyond his personally created progeny to encompass every vampire in the world, turning the entire species into extensions of his will, while eliminating any possibility of future rebellion or independent thought. It was the logical conclusion of his philosophy of vampire supremacy, a system that would ensure perfect obedience from every supernatural being while concentrating absolute power in the hands of a single individual who had already demonstrated his capacity for cruelty and manipulation. The original vampire court lay beneath the city's oldest district, in chambers carved from living rock, when human civilization was nothing more than scattered tribes worshipping gods whose names had been forgotten before the pyramids rose from Egyptian sands. The stronghold had been abandoned when vampire society evolved beyond the need for centralized monarchy, but its ancient halls still resonated with power accumulated over millennia of supernatural rule. If Marcus had spent decades preparing the site for the right of dominion, If he had corrupted those ancient chambers with the same blood magic he had used to desecrate the cathedral catacombs, then he would have access to power sources that could make him effectively unstoppable once the ritual reached its completion. Adrian faced a choice that went beyond personal preference or political calculation into the realm of species survival and moral philosophy. He could attempt to stop Marcus directly, using the conventional methods of supernatural combat that had served vampire society for centuries. But the risk of failure was enormous, and the consequences of Marcus completing the rite of dominion would doom every vampire in existence to eternal slavery under his brother's twisted will. Alternatively, he could attempt to turn Marcus's own power against him, using the Crimson Codex and the ritual components Marcus had assembled to break the peace treaty in ways that served Adrian's purposes rather than his brother's ambitions. But Isabella offered a third option that neither brother had considered: her unique nature as someone who existed at the intersection of human and vampire consciousness, giving her insights that pure supernatural beings couldn't achieve. "Let me complete the ritual," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction, despite the obvious cost such an action would require. "My connection to both Marcus and you, my experience with resisting mental domination while retaining human compassion, my knowledge of both species' strengths and weaknesses, all of it makes me uniquely qualified to redirect the right of dominion towards something that protects rather than enslaves." The proposal carried terrible risks that Adrian understood with crystalline clarity, because completing the rite of dominion would require Isabella to surrender the last traces of her humanity while accepting power that could easily corrupt anyone who wielded it. She would become something unprecedented in vampire history, a being who possessed the ability to influence every supernatural consciousness on Earth while hopefully retaining enough of her original moral compass to use that influence wisely. But the ritual's completion might destroy her entirely, leaving nothing behind but another monster driven by the same hunger for power that had consumed Marcus over the centuries of his existence. As Adrian weighed Isabella's proposal against the alternatives available to him, he realized that the approaching confrontation would determine not just the fate of the peace treaty or the outcome of his conflict with Marcus, but the fundamental nature of what vampire society would become in the centuries ahead. The choice between slavery and freedom, between compassion and cruelty, between coexistence and dominance, all of it would be decided in the ancient chambers where vampire kings had once ruled through fear rather than wisdom, and where the future of two species now hung in the balance like a sword suspended by a thread that grew thinner with each passing moment. The original vampire court lay buried beneath 3 centuries of human construction, its ancient halls carved from living bedrock when the world above had been nothing more than forest and scattered settlements whose inhabitants worshipped gods whose names had been lost to time before the first human empire rose and fell. Adrian descended through passages that grew progressively older as they penetrated deeper into the earth, the walls changing from worked stone to rough-hewn rock to natural caverns that had been shaped by vampire hands when their species was young, and humanity was nothing more than prey to be hunted in moonlit clearings. The air grew thick with accumulated power and ancient blood, carrying scents that triggered memories Adrian had thought buried beneath centuries of political necessity and diplomatic compromise, reminders of what vampires had been before they learned to hide their true nature behind masks of civilized restraint. Marcus waited in the throne room where vampire kings had once held court over domains that stretched across continents, his silver hair gleaming in the light of torches that burned with flames that cast no smoke and gave no warmth. The massive chamber had been carved from a single piece of granite by supernatural hands, its walls rising into shadows that seemed to swallow light itself, while ancient symbols pulsed with malevolent energy that made the air itself feel dense and oppressive. The throne itself was a masterwork of vampire craftsmanship, carved from black obsidian and inlaid with precious metals that had been cooled with the blood of conquered enemies, its surface reflecting fragments of torchlight, like a dark mirror that showed distorted images of past and future mingling in impossible combinations. "Welcome home, dear brother," Marcus said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through the stone chambers and awakened echoes of power that had slumbered for centuries. "This is where we belong, Adrian, not in glass towers negotiating with cattle who plot our extinction while pretending friendship. This is where vampire kings ruled through strength rather than weakness, where our people understood their true nature instead of hiding behind treaties and political compromise." He gestured toward the walls where ancient tapestries depicted vampire history in threads of gold and silver, showing scenes of supernatural dominance that predated human civilization and would continue long after human cities crumbled to dust. The Crimson Codex rested upon an altar that had been carved from a single block of midnight marble, its crystalline surface swirling with energies that pulsed in rhythm with both brothers' heartbeats, while casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. Around the altar, Marcus had arranged dozens of bound vampires in concentric circles, their eyes blank with the absolute mental domination that reduced conscious beings to components in a magical apparatus designed to channel power on a scale that would reshape the supernatural world. Adrian recognized some of them from the missing museum employees, their faces bearing expressions of endless anguish as they were forced to participate in rituals that violated everything they had once believed about human dignity and moral choice. But Marcus's revelation of his true intentions went beyond simple conquest or political rebellion into realms of personal hatred that had festered for centuries, like an infected wound that refused to heal. Through the twisted bond he still maintained with Isabella, despite Adrian's intervention, Marcus projected visions directly into his brother's consciousness that showed the true scope of his resentment and the memories that had shaped his desire for revenge. Adrian saw their father as Marcus remembered him, not the noble vampire lord Adrian recalled, but a creature whose disappointment in his eldest son had been obvious from the moment Adrian began displaying the political acumen and natural leadership that made him the obvious heir to centuries of accumulated power and responsibility. "You were always father's favorite," Marcus whispered, his mental voice carrying currents of pain and rage that had been building for longer than human empires had existed. "Even when we were mortal, even before the transformation that made us what we are now, he saw something in you that he never found in me. I was older, stronger, more willing to embrace the darkness that comes with our nature, but you had the gift for inspiring loyalty without demanding it, for commanding respect without resorting to fear. And when the time came to choose which of his sons would inherit the throne and the responsibility for our people's survival, he chose the younger brother whose mercy he mistook for wisdom." The visions Marcus projected showed centuries of living in Adrian's shadow, watching his younger brother accumulate power and respect, while Marcus's own contributions to vampire society were overlooked or dismissed as unnecessarily cruel. Adrian saw moments he had never witnessed, private conversations where their father expressed doubt about Marcus's fitness for leadership while praising Adrian's diplomatic skills and natural charisma. He experienced Marcus's growing isolation within the vampire court, his gradual turn toward the kind of blood magic and supernatural experimentation that promised power independent of political approval or family recognition. "The right of dominion represents more than simple conquest," Marcus continued, his physical form beginning to blur as supernatural power flowed through him from the bound vampires whose suffering fed his dark magic. "It's the ultimate proof that mercy is weakness, that compassion is a luxury our species cannot afford in a world where humans develop orbital weapons designed for our extermination. When every vampire in existence becomes an extension of my will, when our people finally understand their true nature as apex predators rather than politicians, then we'll reclaim our birthright and show humanity what it means to face creatures who no longer pretend to be their equals." Isabella moved through the ancient corridors with supernatural stealth that combined her human knowledge of building layouts with vampire senses that could detect the faintest traces of supernatural activity. Her connection to Marcus providing her with insights into the ritual's structure, while her bond with Adrian gave her the strength to resist the mental compulsion that should have made independent action impossible. The bound vampires arranged around the Crimson Codex weren't just power sources for the right of dominion, she realized with growing horror. They were conscious components of a magical apparatus that required their continued suffering to function properly. Marcus had designed the ritual to feed on agony rather than simple life force, creating a system where the dominated vampires experienced endless torment while being unable to die or escape their participation in ceremonies that violated everything they had once believed about choice and dignity. The ethical implications of her discovery struck Isabella with the force of a physical blow as she understood the choice Marcus had engineered for her. She could free the bound vampires by breaking the ritual circles that held them in place, but doing so would weaken the magical apparatus and potentially allow Marcus to complete the right of dominion with power drawn from other sources. Alternatively, she could allow their continued suffering to prevent the greater catastrophe of every vampire in the world falling under Marcus's control, but that choice would make her complicit in torture that reduced conscious beings to nothing more than fuel for supernatural ambition. The decision revealed fundamental aspects of the person Isabella was becoming through her transformation from human victim to supernatural being with unprecedented capabilities and responsibilities. Her human compassion demanded that she end the suffering of the bound vampires, regardless of the strategic consequences, while her growing understanding of vampire society and its survival requirements suggested that sometimes individual suffering had to be weighed against species-level extinction. The choice she made would determine not just the outcome of the immediate crisis, but the kind of vampire she would become, whether her enhanced nature would be guided by human moral principles or supernatural pragmatism that subordinated individual welfare to collective survival. Adrian faced Marcus in single combat that stripped away 8 centuries of political sophistication and diplomatic restraint, reducing both brothers to the predatory essence that lay beneath their civilized facades, while the ancient throne room echoed with the sounds of supernatural warfare, conducted at speeds that would have been invisible to human perception. They fought with techniques that had been refined through millennia of vampire conflict, their blades singing through air thick with accumulated power, while their enhanced senses tracked each other's movements with precision that turned combat into a deadly form of choreographed violence, where the slightest mistake would mean immediate and permanent death. But the physical confrontation was merely the surface expression of a deeper conflict that had been building between them for centuries. A war of philosophies and competing visions of what vampire society should become in a world where humanity possessed the technological capability for supernatural genocide. Marcus fought with the desperate fury of someone who believed his entire worldview was under attack, while Adrian struggled with the growing realization that his brother's accusations contained elements of uncomfortable truth that challenged the assumptions underlying everything he had built over the past century. "Your mercy enabled my corruption," Marcus snarled as their blades locked in a test of supernatural strength that sent shockwaves through the granite floor beneath their feet. Every time you chose diplomacy over decisive action, every moment you hesitated to eliminate threats because you wanted to preserve some illusion of moral superiority, you created opportunities for enemies to grow stronger and more dangerous. If you had killed me properly the first time instead of staging a theatrical execution designed to satisfy human observers, none of this would be happening now. The accusation hit Adrian with devastating force because he recognized its essential accuracy, understood that his commitment to appearing reasonable and restrained had sometimes prevented him from taking actions that would have prevented greater suffering in the long term. His execution of Marcus had indeed been designed more for political effect than practical necessity, intended to demonstrate vampire commitment to treaty compliance while preserving some possibility of his brother's eventual redemption and return to family grace. The mercy Adrian had shown had enabled Marcus to survive, to plan, to create bound vampires, and develop the supernatural capabilities that now threatened both species with catastrophic war. Isabella's choice in the ritual chamber came with the kind of moral clarity that cut through centuries of accumulated political complexity and philosophical debate. She moved through the circles of bound vampires with supernatural speed, her enhanced abilities allowing her to break the magical restraints that held them in place while simultaneously severing her own connection to Marcus through an act of will that felt like tearing out pieces of her own consciousness. The bound vampires collapsed as their mental domination ended, their expressions shifting from blank obedience to confusion and terror as they regained awareness of their surroundings and their unwilling participation in rituals they found morally abhorrent. The severance of Isabella's connection to Marcus sent shockwaves through the rite of dominion that destabilized the entire magical apparatus, causing the Crimson Codex to pulse with unstable energy while the ancient symbols carved into the throne room walls flickered between activation and dormancy. Marcus screamed with rage and pain as he felt his carefully constructed network of mental control beginning to collapse, his grand design for vampire supremacy crumbling under the weight of Isabella's sacrifice and the freed vampires' rejection of their assigned roles in his ceremonies. But Marcus's final gambit revealed the true depths of his hatred and his willingness to destroy everything rather than accept defeat at the hands of a brother he viewed as unworthy of the power fate had granted him. Deep within the throne room's ancient structure, he had planted what amounted to a supernatural explosive device, a concentration of corrupted blood magic that could be triggered to transform every human within miles into mindless vampires whose uncontrolled hunger would make coexistence impossible and justify the orbital weapon strikes that would eliminate vampire society entirely. The blood bomb represented the ultimate expression of his philosophy, a weapon that would force the war he believed was inevitable while ensuring that neither species could claim victory in the conflict that would follow. Adrian faced the impossible choice between saving the city's human population and preserving his relationship with the brother who had become his greatest enemy. Understanding that Marcus's final trap was designed to force him into decisions that would validate everything his elder brother believed about the fundamental incompatibility between vampire survival and human welfare. But Isabella's sacrifice had given her capabilities that transcended the normal limitations of vampire consciousness, allowing her to use the last fragments of her connection to Marcus to turn his own power against him in ways that collapsed the ritual while preventing the blood bomb's detonation. The ancient throne room filled with light that had no earthly source as the rite of dominion's accumulated power turned back upon itself, consuming Marcus in flames that burned away centuries of accumulated hatred, while leaving behind only the memory of what he might have become if different choices had shaped his existence. The cost of victory was higher than anyone had expected, leaving Adrian with the knowledge that saving both species had required sacrifices that would haunt him for whatever centuries remained of his existence, while Isabella faced a future transformed by power and responsibility she had never sought but now could never abandon. Marcus's death sent shockwaves through the vampire world that rippled outward like cracks in ancient glass, shattering political alliances that had endured for centuries while forcing every supernatural being to confront fundamental questions about their nature and their place in a world where humanity possessed weapons capable of species extinction. The news traveled through vampire communication networks with supernatural speed, carried by messengers who moved through shadows and blood bonds that connected the far-flung communities of the undead across every continent where their kind had established strongholds and safe havens. In the ancient courts of Europe, vampire nobles who had survived the fall of human empires found themselves debating whether Adrian's victory represented salvation or the beginning of an era where their species would be forever subservient to human tolerance and technological superiority. In the hidden enclaves of Asia, vampire scholars who had devoted centuries to studying the balance between predator and prey wondered whether the peace treaty's survival meant their people had permanently abandoned their evolutionary birthright in exchange for safety that could be revoked at any moment. In the New World territories where younger vampires had built societies based on integration rather than domination, the news brought relief mixed with recognition that their entire way of existence had been balanced on the edge of a blade that could have fallen either direction, with catastrophic consequences for everyone involved. Adrian stood in the ruins of the ancient throne room where he had fought and killed his brother, surrounded by the debris of collapsed magical rituals and the lingering scent of supernatural fire that had consumed centuries of accumulated hatred in a conflagration that left nothing behind but ash and memory. The Crimson Codex lay shattered at his feet, its crystalline surface cracked beyond repair, but still pulsing with residual energy that would take decades to fully dissipate, while the bound vampires Marcus had created huddled in corners of the chamber like children awakening from nightmares they couldn't quite remember, but would never entirely forget. Isabella moved among them with gentle efficiency, her enhanced senses allowing her to assess their mental states, while her experience with resisting supernatural compulsion gave her insights into the kind of rehabilitation they would need to reclaim their agency and rebuild their shattered identities. The immediate aftermath of Marcus's defeat required Adrian to make decisions that would reshape vampire society in ways that went far beyond simple political restructuring, because the revelation of human weapons programs and the near collapse of the peace treaty had exposed fundamental flaws in the assumptions underlying supernatural civilization for over a century. Director Hayes contacted Adrian within hours of the ancient court's destruction, his voice carrying the strain of someone who had spent sleepless days preventing orbital weapons from reducing vampire strongholds to radioactive craters, while simultaneously trying to explain to military commanders why the magical disturbances that had threatened human cities had suddenly ceased without any visible resolution or surrender from supernatural forces. "We came closer to genocide than either of our species realizes," Hayes admitted during their emergency conference call, his words measured with the precision of someone who understood that diplomatic language was the only thing preventing a war that would leave both civilizations in ruins. The weapons platforms were 36 hours from activation when the magical disturbances stopped, and even now there are factions within human government who believe we should have proceeded with the strikes regardless of whether the immediate threat had ended. They argue that Marcus's rebellion proves vampire society is inherently unstable, that any peace treaty is merely a temporary expedient, while they develop better methods for eliminating human oversight. Adrian recognized the political reality underlying Hayes's carefully diplomatic warnings, understanding that human extremists would use Marcus's rebellion as justification for preventive action against vampire populations, while vampire hardliners would interpret human weapons development as proof that coexistence was impossible and only preemptive war could ensure their species' survival. The peace treaty that had prevented mutual annihilation for over a century had been revealed as inadequate to address the fundamental mistrust and competing survival interests that drove both sides toward conflict, despite their rational recognition that war would benefit no one. But Isabella's transformation from victim to survivor to something unprecedented in vampire history had given her insights that neither pure human nor traditional vampire perspectives could achieve, making her uniquely qualified to serve as a bridge between species whose differences ran deeper than simple biological variation. Her retention of human compassion and moral reasoning, combined with vampire-enhanced capabilities and supernatural longevity, created a perspective that could address the concerns of both sides while avoiding the extremism that had driven Marcus toward rebellion and human leadership toward developing weapons of mass supernatural destruction. The bound vampires Marcus had created presented challenges that went beyond simple rehabilitation because their transformation had been conducted without consent and under circumstances that left them traumatized by experiences they could remember but had been powerless to prevent. Unlike traditional vampire creation, where the new supernatural being could choose whether to embrace or reject their enhanced nature, Marcus's victims had been given no opportunity to make informed decisions about their existence while being forced to participate in activities that violated their fundamental moral principles and sense of personal identity. Adrian established sanctuaries within his fortress where the rescued vampires could receive counseling and support, while deciding whether to continue their supernatural existence or seek the kind of peaceful death that would release them from unwanted immortality. Isabella took personal responsibility for leading the rehabilitation efforts. Her own experience with resisting supernatural compulsion, making her the most qualified counselor available, while her background in art restoration gave her insights into the patient work required to repair damaged souls and reconstruct shattered identities. Some of the rescued vampires chose to embrace their enhanced capabilities while working to integrate their new nature with their original moral frameworks, finding ways to satisfy their supernatural needs without compromising the ethical principles that had defined their human existence. Others struggled with the predatory instincts that came with vampire transformation, torn between hunger that demanded satisfaction and moral revulsion at the idea of treating humans as prey rather than equals deserving of respect and protection. But the most challenging cases involved rescued vampires who had fully embraced their predatory nature during their bondage to Marcus, finding in supernatural power and enhanced capabilities an intoxicating freedom from the moral constraints that had limited their human existence. These individuals had to confront the reality that their liberation from Marcus's mental control didn't automatically restore their original ethical frameworks. That freedom to choose meant accepting responsibility for decisions that could harm innocent people while satisfying supernatural appetites that would persist for the remainder of their immortal existence. The process of rebuilding supernatural society required Adrian to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about the foundations upon which vampire civilization had been constructed, recognizing that his own commitment to diplomatic solutions had sometimes enabled problems to grow worse through neglect rather than decisive action. His mercy toward Marcus after their first conflict had created the opportunity for his brother to develop the capabilities that nearly destroyed both species, while his acceptance of human assurances about defensive weapons programs had left vampire society vulnerable to technological threats that could have eliminated their entire species within hours of activation. 6 months after Marcus's death, Adrian and Isabella worked together to establish what they called the New Compact, a treaty structure that replaced the careful diplomatic language and hidden clauses of the original peace treaty with transparent acknowledgement of both species' needs and concerns, while creating mechanisms for addressing extremist elements on both sides before they could threaten the stability of supernatural human coexistence. The negotiations required unprecedented levels of honesty about capabilities and intentions, with human leadership providing detailed information about weapons development programs, while vampire society opened its most carefully guarded secrets about supernatural abilities and population distributions. Isabella's role in the negotiations transcended simple diplomatic translation because her unique perspective as someone who had chosen to become fully vampire while retaining human ethical frameworks made her invaluable in addressing concerns that neither pure human nor traditional vampire representatives could understand or articulate effectively. She could explain to human negotiators why vampire society's survival requirements made certain compromises impossible, while helping vampire leadership understand how human fear of supernatural predation drove political decisions that seemed irrational or unnecessarily hostile from a supernatural perspective. The relationship that developed between Adrian and Isabella during the months of reconstruction and treaty negotiation grew beyond the emergency bonds forged during crisis into something built on mutual respect and shared understanding of the burdens that came with responsibility for species-level survival and political stability. Their connection remained complicated by the supernatural bonds created through blood sharing and shared trauma, but both recognized that their partnership had become essential to maintaining the peace that protected millions of innocent lives on both sides of the species divide. The new compact's public presentation took place in a specially constructed amphitheater that could accommodate both human and vampire representatives while providing security measures that satisfied the most paranoid factions on both sides, with Isabella standing before the mixed assembly to advocate for a future where supernatural transformation could be approached as a matter of informed choice, rather than predatory violence or political manipulation. Her speech addressed the fundamental question that had driven Marcus toward rebellion and human leadership toward developing genocide weapons, acknowledging that both species possess the capability to destroy the other, while arguing that survival required cooperation, rather than the kind of mutual assured destruction that had characterized military thinking during humanity's most dangerous historical periods. Adrian watched from the shadows at the amphitheater's edge, no longer the untouchable vampire king whose word was law, but a leader who had learned to balance the exercise of power with acknowledgement of his own limitations and the need for perspectives that differed from his own centuries of accumulated experience and political instincts. The transformation in his approach to leadership reflected lessons learned through nearly losing everything to a brother whose rebellion had been enabled by the very qualities that made Adrian an effective diplomat and political moderate. The final image of their partnership showed Isabella and Adrian working late into the night in the rebuilt council chambers, planning for implementation of treaty provisions that would ensure the next person in Isabella's situation wouldn't have to beg for death to escape unwanted supernatural transformation, because they would be given genuine choice about embracing or refusing enhanced nature, along with honest information about the benefits and costs that came with vampire existence. The bite mark that had brought them together during the crisis had faded to a silver scar that reminded both of them about the price of survival and the possibility of redemption for even the most damaged souls and broken political systems. The peace treaty they had forged wasn't perfect, containing compromises that satisfied no one completely, while creating mechanisms for ongoing negotiation and adjustment as both species adapted to changed circumstances and evolving capabilities. But it was honest in ways that the original peace treaty had never achieved, acknowledging the fundamental tensions and competing interests that would always exist between predator and prey species, while providing frameworks for managing those conflicts through dialogue, rather than the kind of warfare that would leave both civilizations in ruins, regardless of which side claimed victory in any final confrontation. In a world where both species possessed the capability for mutual annihilation, honesty about intentions and limitations might represent the only foundation strong enough to support lasting peace between creatures whose evolutionary heritage had programmed them to view each other as either food or existential threat, depending on which perspective dominated their political and cultural development.